All right, so welcome to the deep dive. We're all about taking those sources you're curious about and, well, diving deep to pull out the really interesting stuff. Your shortcut to some serious knowledge, you could say.
And today, we're going to tackle something that affects pretty much everything, whether we realize it or not. Randomness. We're using Fooled by Randomness as our guide, and we're going to see how chance, how randomness plays a much bigger role in our lives than we often give it credit for, especially in markets.
For sure. So for you, our listener, if you love to learn, if you love those aha moments, and you want to understand these complex ideas without getting bogged down, well, this is for you. It doesn't matter what your background is. We're going to keep it clear. We're going to keep it fun. We've gone through articles, research papers, even some of your own notes on the topic. Our mission here is to really unpack this idea of randomness, see where luck ends and skill begins, and figure out why our brains just seem to have such a hard time wrapping themselves around probability. Listener, get ready for some mind-bending stuff here. Let's start with, how our brains get all tangled up with randomness.
One really fascinating thing to think about is how our brains actually evolved. So imagine our ancestors way back when in a much simpler world, right? Less information coming at them. In that kind of environment, it was almost like a survival mechanism to look for patterns, even if those patterns weren't really there.
Right.
Picture a caveman scratching his nose and then boom, it starts raining. And then he thinks, maybe my nose scratching caused the rain. Superstitions are born.
It's crazy how those old instincts, they still kind of pop up today.
Yeah.
Right? Like we see the central bank lower interest rates and then the economy starts doing well and we think, see, it works.
Right.
Where a company brings in a hotshot new CEO, their profits go up. But a lot of what happens is just random. It's noise.
Yeah.
The author really drives this point home. We constantly underestimate the sheer power of chance in almost everything. So takeaway number one. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines in a world that's often surprisingly chaotic.
Totally. And you know what? It's important to remember that probability theory, especially its application to practice, is a relatively new thing in human history. Our brains simply haven't had the time to fully adapt, and this leads to what we call probability blindness, a real difficulty to intuitively grasp and really process probabilities. Let me ask you, imagine someone tells you there's a 1 in a million chance of winning the lottery. You know intellectually that that's a tiny chance. But doesn't it still feel exciting?
Yeah.
That excitement of a potential win can still feel very real.
Totally. That vacation example the author gives, that one really hit home for me. Like if you're trying to decide between a trip to Paris or the Bahamas, your brain just can't picture a 50-50 chance of experiencing both, like Parisian rain and a Bahamian beach at the same time. So we want just one clear outcome.
Exactly. Our minds really tend to fixate on singular possibilities. And, Nero's situation after his diagnosis, that really illustrates this point well.
Yeah.
Faced with a 28% chance of death versus a 72% chance of survival, his mind immediately went to either, being dead or, fully recovered and skiing in the Alps, rather than actually grappling with the probabilistic reality. So another key takeaway here, when it comes to probability, our brains prefer certainty over the messy reality of probabilities.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty here. Let's talk trading. The author sees trading as this intense, sometimes brutal testing ground for figuring out what's luck and what's actual skill. Why is the trading floor such a good, albeit risky, laboratory for this?
Well, in trading, you see, the results are very immediate. Profits, losses, right there in your face. It's tempting to look at someone who's consistently making money and assume, they have this special talent, some magical winning strategy. But what this book argues is that a huge chunk of even that seemingly consistent success can be purely random. It's chance. So consistent profits, they don't always equal skill.
Right. And that could be really dangerous, right? Creating this kind of illusion of skill when really Lady Luck might be pulling most of the strings. The author calls it charlatanism in some cases.
Exactly. And I think the contrasting stories of Nero, who's kind of this probabilistic introspector, and John, the high-yield trader, they really drive this point home. Nero, maybe not as flashy, not as successful on the surface as John, but he understood that there's always the risk of a blow-up, those rare but devastating events. He was very careful about limiting his potential for huge losses. John, on the other hand, he was all about leverage, taking on these massive hidden risks that he didn't seem to fully grasp.
And that's where survivorship bias kicks in, doesn't it? We see the Johns of the world who made a killing, the entrepreneurs who struck gold, the traders with those amazing returns. But we miss all the others who took similar gambles and just completely busted. It's like, don't be fooled by the highlight reel. The graveyard of failed attempts is huge.
Oh, absolutely. Our minds have this real struggle with grasping this idea of alternative histories. All those other paths that could have happened but didn't. We tend to look at the one path that did happen, the one that played out, and assume that that was the most likely, maybe even the only possible one.
Right.
That Russian roulette analogy is pretty powerful. Someone could be playing this incredibly risky game without even knowing it and think it's totally safe just because the bullet hasn't come up yet.
Okay, so that brings us to this concept, the problem of induction. This sounds pretty academic. What is it, and why does it matter so much when we're talking about randomness?
Sure. Think about it this way. Just because you've only ever seen white swans doesn't mean that there are no black swans out there. The problem of induction, really, it's about the challenge of drawing these big conclusions from specific observations. And, in a world where randomness is such a big player, especially in something like financial markets where these random events can compound over time, well, this problem becomes incredibly important. So past patterns, they don't guarantee future results, especially in a random world.
Right, so we see a new technology and we think, this is it. This is going to change everything. The author calls it the new things trap. We forget about all the failed innovations, all the duds, all the things that didn't work. The author calls this the toxicity of all the garbage you have to sift through to get to the truly great stuff.
Totally, yeah. And this is directly related to learning from history. The author points out that we've had all these market crashes, right, in 1987, 1990, and on, where people ignored these past lessons. They said, this time it's different, and they often paid the price. It's a bit like what's called Solon's warning. You can't really judge a person's life until it's over. And by extension, you can't really judge the nature of events until after they've played out.
Right, okay. Let's talk about something called skewness. This might sound a bit technical. Can you break this down in a way that makes sense, that clicks?
Of course. Skewness is basically about how lopsided or imbalanced a set of possibilities is. You see, the author argues that, in many real-world situations, especially in the markets, just saying bull for going up or bear for going down, well, it's too simplistic. It doesn't capture how uneven the potential for gains and losses can be.
So it's like you could have an investment that makes small gains, say it goes up 1%, and it does that 70% of the time, right? 70% of the time it's up 1%, so it's pretty good. But then the other 30% of the time it has big drops, like 10%.
Exactly. So even though you're winning, you're making money more often. The size of those occasional losses, those big drops, they wipe out all those little gains and you end up with a negative expected return. That's what matters, the magnitude of those infrequent events. Not just how often you're up. The peso problem is a great example of this. Seemingly stable investments with these hidden gotchas. They can have these rare but catastrophic events that can just wipe out investors. And they've been lulled into this false sense of security by, a long period of stability. Think about the Mexican peso in the 90s or the Russian ruble crisis in 98. These are like prime examples of this hidden risk that can really hurt. So skewness, frequent small wins, can hide the potential for rare but huge losses. Really important to understand.
This is making me think about how journalists and these so-called experts often talk about randomness. What's the author's take on their interpretations?
Well, the author is, shall we say, not very impressed. He says that the media, they try to come up with these neat, tidy explanations for what are really just random market movements.
Right.
These so-called Bloomberg explanations, trying to attribute cause to what's essentially just noise. And they often get probabilities mixed up, creating even more confusion. That image the author uses of watching CNBC with the sound off. Brilliant.
It's so true, just seeing all these talking heads trying to make sense of every little blip.
Exactly. It's often just filling airtime without any real insight. And the author makes a really interesting distinction between what he calls scientific intellectuals and literary intellectuals. He suggests that the literary intellectuals are more easily impressed by scientific jargon. They get fooled by randomness. They don't really understand the underlying concepts. And he brings up this idea of a reverse Turing test, where computers can actually generate text that sounds like postmodernist writing.
Oh, wow. Kind of highlighting the lack of real substance in some of this intellectual discourse. And, people who've been fooled by randomness, they tend to have way too high an opinion of their own predictive abilities. They think they've got it figured out when really it might just be luck.
Okay, so how do we get better at understanding, at actually navigating this random world? The author talks about something called Monte Carlo simulation as a tool. What is that exactly? How can it help someone like our listener? So Monte Carlo methods, they're all about creating basically artificial histories. You run thousands, even millions of simulations using random numbers. And you're modeling these different possible sequences of events. So instead of just looking at a few scenarios, you can see this whole range of possibilities. You can see how randomness plays out over time. You get these sample paths, the author calls them. You get a much better feel for the impact of chance than you would with, just a few static scenarios. It's like simulating Russian roulette thousands of times. It really makes those probabilities sink in. We can see not just what might happen, but what could have probably happened.
Okay, so practically, how could our listener use this kind of thinking? Say, for example, they're evaluating a new business venture.
Right. So instead of just focusing on the best case scenario, right, the super optimistic outcome, they could imagine all sorts of possibilities, good and bad. They could think about how likely each one is, and that can give them a much more realistic picture.
Makes sense. Now, the author brings in Karl Popper, the philosopher. What's the connection between Popper's ideas and understanding randomness?
Popper's big idea was that in science, it's more important to try and prove a theory wrong than to try to prove it right. A good scientific theory, it's one that you can test, that you can potentially falsify. The author points out that something like astrology, it's not scientific because you can't really disprove it. And Popper, he was also skeptical of just gathering more and more data and assuming that automatically gives you more knowledge, which is really relevant in a world filled with all this random noise.
So it's about focusing on what we don't know, right? On those things that could overturn what we think we know, rather than just getting stuck on the things we're comfortable with.
Yeah, precisely. That Popperian emphasis on being open to being wrong, on actively trying to find the flaws in our thinking, it really lines up with the need to have an open mind when you're dealing with randomness. The author gives the example of George Soros, famous for changing his investment positions quickly when the evidence changes. That's embodying a Popperian approach.
That's cool. Now, on to gambler's ticks. Those little rituals people do when they're playing games of chance. What's up with those?
These are those seemingly irrational behaviors that people link to success, even in totally random situations. That story about the taxi driver who convinced himself that his trading profits were connected to how he parked his cab.
Yeah,
A
wild.
perfect example of this, the author suggests that some of these superstitious behaviors, they might be hardwired. Our brains trying to find patterns, trying to exert control in situations that are inherently unpredictable.
Right. And this ties into this tricky problem of separating true skill from just dumb luck. Even when we're talking about experts, this idea of an overcrowding of experts.
Absolutely. Someone might have an impressive track record, but they might just have been really lucky. There's that old saying, a broken clock is right twice a day. If you have a large enough group of people doing something, some of them are going to look successful purely by chance. It's like the monkeys on typewriters eventually writing Shakespeare, right? Past success on its own, it doesn't tell you much. You have to consider how many others tried and failed. Survivorship bias, once again. And now, with these huge data sets we have today, there's a real danger of data mining, just finding random patterns in all that data.
So if our brains are so easily fooled by randomness, what's the root cause? Why are we wired this way?
The author says it's about survival. Our brains evolved to keep us alive, to reproduce, not to necessarily be great at probability calculations. We're much more sensitive to threats than to, subtle statistical realities. And he talks about option blindness, how we often underestimate the value of having options. We just can't properly evaluate those uncertain future payoffs in our heads. We confuse the most likely outcome with the actual expected value. It explains why some people are drawn to, say, selling options. They get those small, steady returns. It feels safe, even though it exposes them to those rare but massive losses. They have trouble holding on to those long volatility positions, the ones that could pay off big but less frequently. We're often irrational when it comes to markets and randomness, even when we think we're being perfectly rational.
And finally, the author touches on the idea of stoicism. How does that fit in with all of this?
Stoicism here, it's not about suppressing emotions. It's more about recognizing what we can control and what we can't. And in this context, Stoicism, it's really about accepting that randomness, that inherent randomness of the world, and focusing on our own reactions, our own actions, not trying to fight the unpredictable, finding a kind of peace in acknowledging the limits of our control.
So to wrap up this deep dive into Fooled by Randomness, what are the big takeaways? What do we really need to remember?
First, randomness, it's everywhere, more than we think. Second, our brains are wired in a way that makes it difficult to really grasp and accept randomness. Third, telling the difference between luck and skill, it's incredibly tough, especially in something like trading. Fourth, we got to be super careful about relying only on past performance or the opinions of experts without a solid understanding of probability, survivorship bias, all that stuff. And lastly, always think about those alternative histories, the paths that could have happened but didn't.
Exactly. Our aim today was to give you, our listener, this clear and engaging path through these really complex ideas in Fooled by Randomness.
So, here's something to think about. Take a look at different areas of your life, your career, how you invest, even your hobbies. Where might you be underestimating the role of chance or mistaking a lucky streak for real skill? What assumptions are you making that maybe you need to challenge a little bit?
Some great food for thought there. We encourage you to dig a little deeper, maybe revisit the book itself, and explore these ideas even more.
Absolutely. And we'll be back for our next deep dive where we'll tackle another fascinating topic in a way that's accessible, insightful, and always tailored to your curiosity.
See you next time.